In this video, I'm going to talk about what is a nomological network. A nomological network can be considered as a relationship between knowledge or ideas, nomo coming from knowledge. This is important because it helps us visualize the questions that we want to ask. The world is a confusing place. There's a lot of data, and we can't make out the signal from the noise. We can't actually figure out the patterns around what is happening around us. And so nomological networks allow us to clarify the question that we are trying to ask and the ideas that are relevant in this question. For example, you might ask, how does X affect Y? You might also ask, what is the role of X in Y process? You might also ask, how does X occur in Y process? These are different types of questions that you can ask. When you're asking how does X affect Y, you're going to build a very specific type of nomological network. You're going to build a variance model. A variance model simply means that the answer that you're trying to get is, well, X affects Y in this way. The greater X is, the greater Y is. Or, you guessed it, the greater X is, the less Y there is. The less Y happens, okay? Now, there's another type of nomological network that you can build, which is called a process model. So you might ask, what is the role of X in Y process? Or how does X occur in Y process? So let's take a process. You have different stages. This could be brushing your teeth. First, you take your toothbrush, then you put toothpaste on your toothbrush, and then you brush your teeth, right? Simple process. You're trying to find out what is the role of X in Y process. So one example could be when X exists, we actually have that. So when it's 6 a.m. in the morning and 9 p.m. at night, this toothbrushing thing happens. Or it could be something else. It might be when it's these times specifically on the clock, these things happen. And when this time is not on the clock, something else happens to the toothbrush. The toothpaste stays in the toothpaste. The toothbrush stays in the toothbrush cup. And both toothpaste and the toothbrush do not go anywhere near the teeth, right? So you have a different effect of X on Y. Now, you could also have another example when you're trying to answer the question, what is the role of X in Y process? What you might be looking for is basically, how does X occur in Y process? So you might have X occurs here. We thought that X occurs at the beginning. We thought that X occurs at the end. Actually, my data shows that X occurs right here. All right, so what is a nomological network? A nomological network is sorry, I thought you couldn't hear me anymore. I think that you can still hear me. Okay, all right, well, let's just keep going. All right, so what is a nomological network then? Essentially, you can think of it as just boxes and arrows, very simple. So let's go into a detailed example. Let's say we have two ideas, okay? In research, we call these constructs. Ideas are things that you think of in your head. In an investigation, you basically want to describe that idea to a detailed level so that that idea becomes a construct, like the construct of strength, right? Strength has to do with power, be one thing. The concept of nutrition. Nutrition could have to do with balance, could have to do with quantities. You really want to define the construct, okay? Now you might have a construct called the sustainability of a product, right? And you might have another construct called the attractiveness or desirability of that product to a customer. So what you're trying to do an investigation here is maybe an investigation on fashion, where you're saying that the more sustainable the product is, the more attractive it is to a specific type of customer, right? So what is the theoretical relationship between these two constructs? Essentially, they're just positively correlated. Very simple, right? If the arrows are facing different directions, then it's negatively correlated, right? Very simple. Now, if this is what you want to study, that's cool, but how are you going to measure it? So you might say, well, I'm going to measure the sustainability of the product by the percentage of production materials that are recycled within that specific product. And I'm going to measure the attractiveness and desirability of that product to a customer by looking at how many Gen Z purchase that product as a percentage of the entire amount of customers. Or I could ask Gen Z just to rate it. Rate this product. That's my metric, right? These are some examples of metrics. You might also say, okay, well, because a percentage of production materials recycled is not the most accurate metric, I'm also going to combine that metric with relative carbon footprint to a competitor, right? And maybe what I'll do is both metrics will be out of 10 and I'll take the average, right? When you do that, if you're constructing a metric, if you're constructing a metric, you'd call that a variable. And you'd call this process of taking that construct and measuring it, making it concrete, you call that operationalization, okay? So this is a theoretical framework. This is a conceptual framework. And this is basically the core of research. What you're trying to do is you're trying to understand the relationship between constructs, between ideas. And what you're doing is you're theorizing. You're saying that these two constructs are related to each other in this way. And then you try to explain why. Okay, that is basically what theorizing is. Now, why does this matter? This matters in order for you to motivate your research investigation. Why should I be reading this paper? Why have you bothered to spend time that you could be doing something else researching this? Don't we already know the relationship between these two constructs? Okay, so there are different ways to prove that your investigation should be funded, should have occurred, why the findings matter, okay? Why the findings could matter. There are different ways to do it. Let me just show you one example. So let's go back to our idea of a variance model. How does X affect Y? What you need to do is you need to make the case that people care about this question. Now, most of the time when we talk about research motivation, most of the time when we talk about motivation, personal motivation, we say, well, I care about why X affects Y because I grew up in X industry. My family founded a company in X, and I personally really care about Y, right? So this could be my family's been in fashion X, right? And I personally really care about sustainability, right? Or something else, right? You can replace X and Y with what you want. That's called a personal motivation. What we want is a research-based motivation. And the research-based motivation comes from the literature. It comes from understanding what on earth scholars are talking about. What on earth has been analyzed? What on earth do we know? So we might say, we might do some reading and we might find some people say X leads to Y. We also might find some papers where Z leads to Y. Sorry, that should say Y, not X, right? And when we say some people, we're talking about scholars, right? I just edited that typo. All right, so we're reading the literature and we report back in our research motivation, and we also summarize this in our discussion section of our research paper. What do we summarize? We summarize what scholars have said. Some people say X leads to Y, some people say Z leads to Y, right? We don't know. Therefore, this dissertation seeks to understand how does X affect Y or whatever. So this is just an example of, where the construct is unknown. Another example could be that some people say that these two items are positively correlated. Some people say they're negatively correlated. Some people say that there's a third item that affects whether it's positively or negatively correlated. Because we don't know enough about that third item, this dissertation really looks at that third item and how it affects these two constructs, right? Essentially, that's what you want to do. Okay, in conclusion, I'm going to show you what a PhD dissertation looks like. So this is my figure from my own PhD that I completed in 2018. And what you see is you see different things that affect a construct called hybridity and how hybridity leads to organizational outcomes, whether failure or performance benefits. And what's really key about this figure is that every relationship, every arrow has citations, right? So there are a lot of papers here because I read a lot of papers, right? But what you need to do when you're theorizing is you need to support every arrow with at least one, maybe two or three papers. Okay. So what kind of papers? Hopefully you're going to be able to cite papers that are empirical. That means papers that actually use data, analyze data, right? Sometimes you're doing something that's so new that we actually don't know a lot about it, in which case you can use conceptual papers. So you see here, I have put a conceptual paper, Beshrov and Smith, 2014. It's a conceptual study, okay? And what you want to find is you want to find, as you're reading everything that's related to the constructs you care about, right? I care about a lot of constructs. That's why this looks so complicated. But if you only care about one or two two or three constructs, then you might not have to read that much. And you can also narrow it down more by looking at the constructs in a specific context. So my PhD was on a specific type of hybridity. It was about commercial and social hybridity, right? But I did cite some papers. So for example, Pratt and Raffaelli, which is another type of hybrid, right? Not a social commercial hybrid. Now, if I wanted to reduce the number of papers that I look at, I would only look at social commercial hybrids. But here I wanted to be slightly more comprehensive. Okay, so every arrow needs to have some citation. But what's really exciting is when you find arrows that really matter that have no citation. So here, for example, hybridity in organizations and decisions, they're not too many. How individual attributes affect decisions in hybrids, there's not that many papers. and how organizational activities between organizations, not within, but between, there's not that many. There's only these 2 papers that I found, right? And so that becomes exciting because then it's like, well, really, scholars are missing a piece of the puzzle. And that's why I'm doing my research, because this puzzle is important and I can solve it. There we go. But before we get too crazy on that, let's just think about a few boxes and arrows that you care about, right? Whatever it is, put your idea in there, okay? And try to figure out what the literature is saying and where you come in there, okay? I hope that helps explain how the literature will affect. I hope that'll explain how the literature will affect your research motivation and how the research motivation and the literature actually leads to your question. You want to ask a question that matters within the nomological network, and you want to also ask a question that we don't know the answer to. Okay, so I hope this helps. Talk to you soon.